The History of the Old Brick Church podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum, located in Smithfield, Virginia. As a museum and historic site, St. Luke's focuses on the development of religious freedom and the early American religious experience. This program was supported by a grant from Virginia Humanities.
And welcome back, everyone, to History from the Old Brick Church podcast, a podcast of St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum in beautiful Smithfield, Virginia. I'm John Ericson, your host, and we are glad that you're with us. And we're very glad to have with us today David Callaway, the religious specialist for the Freedom Forum. And I'm going to let David tell us a little bit about his role at the forum and what the forum's all about. But our first question is always one about history. Why history? And I know, David, you're not strictly a historian, but I know that you have a vast historic education, and it's crucial to your role. So I'm going to ask you that same question we ask of everyone in our podcast, why you're interested in history.
Well, thanks so much for having me, John. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I think you probably heard a lot of great answers to this. So it's tough to pick just one thing that draws me to the study of history. But I think in particular, I'm drawn to the stories of people who are just like you and me, with all of the same kind of mental and physical capabilities as both of us, who are trying to make their way through the world, often asking really similar questions to us. And so that's true for humans for literally hundreds of thousands of years. And I think history is this rich kind of background for us to really take lessons forward and say, great, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and how can we work together to create a better society for us all. And so I think that's one of the most important takeaways you can really or takeaways from history that a student can have.
That's a great answer. Thank you, David. So tell us a little bit about the Freedom Forum and what your role is there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Freedom Forum is a nonpartisan, non-sectarian organization that fosters First Amendment freedoms for all Americans. And what that really means is, for us, our First Amendment rights are inalienable, and it's critical. They're critical to a pluralistic democracy. So often I think conversations about First Amendment rights, or just rights in general, kind of begin and end with the statement of, I have these rights, I have the right to religious freedom, or I have the right to free speech, but they don't, like, so what? So, okay, so what do we do with that? And I think the First Amendment really is a framework for saying, great, we're all given these rights, these inalienable rights. And what do we do with that then when we're going to have conflict? Because I think, what's really critical to remember is that, unlike most countries in history, the United States was not founded on a shared background or shared experience or shared religion or shared ethnicity, but on shared values. And one of them was that what it means to be an American is that you can have deeply held beliefs and, as much as possible, exercise those beliefs. And so that then requires us to say, great, how do we do that together? And one of the things we really stress at the Freedom Forum is that we all have a responsibility to protect each other's rights, and that's in fact the best way to protect our own. So that's a little bit about what we do. We really see ourselves as a convener and a bringer together of lots of people across the religious and political spectrum, because again, we think that's what the First Amendment can do. We think it can help provide some common ground in a country where that's kind of harder and harder to find as time goes on.
So as the religious freedom specialist, you work with schools, other organizations to promote those ideals of the First Amendment?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background in particular is with religion and education. And so I've trained thousands of educators, administrators, district officials on how to teach about religion constitutionally and academically. And that's a really important space, because there are few people who have to navigate the First Amendment quite like educators, who are constantly kind of going between their roles as government employee, private citizen, and often in loco parentis guardian. And that's a really hard triangle to navigate. And so a lot of my time at the Freedom Forum has been helping educators kind of do that well, and really be able to speak to religious identity in the classroom authentically, and to identify religious freedom issues that come up. So, if a student wants to pray, or a student has an issue with an assignment, those kinds of things, how can we find a way where everyone can achieve their goals, both the school and say the family?
So there was a recent Supreme Court decision about school prayer, and I know that the Freedom Forum is not a partisan group. So how do you respond to decisions like the most recent one? And maybe you could just articulate what that was about, and if it should be of concern for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So that case is Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, and Coach Kennedy was a football coach, or is a football coach, who was punished by the district for praying on the football field after games. And as you mentioned, we are a nonpartisan organization, and so we don't really take a side of, like, this is how the Supreme Court interprets it is First Amendment law. So what our goal is to really help people understand the case and understand its impacts. And so if we kind of go from my lens, and my specialty is as related to religion in public schools, this case has caused a lot of confusion. So I don't know about you, but I know on my social media, I've seen a lot of, like, either political cartoons, or people complaining or praising the idea that teachers can now lead students in prayer. And then what's really important is that that's not actually what Coach Kennedy, what the court said, and when they were ruling in favor of Coach Kennedy. So one of the things that we've been working hard on as an organization, and with a lot of our stakeholders, is helping them understand that in the case of this big Supreme Court case, there, rather than getting really into the kind of nitty gritty of how it all happened, what's really important to know is that the outside looks different from how the court ruled. And no matter what you may have seen pictures of Coach Kennedy doing, or may have read about him doing, what the court did is they said that his prayer was brief, private, and quiet, and that allowed him to then pray on the field. They also had some concerns about whether or not he was representing the government at that point, but they mostly put those to the side. And so, for us, what we have gone out and tried to help people understand is that in the practical world, for most people, this actually hasn't changed much of anything, and the guidelines that you were already following, or expecting your students' teachers to follow, they already should, because we've often said that, look, you can pray in private in public schools if you're an educator, before a school, after school, in the faculty lounge. That's totally all right. We've even said, like, look, if it's during a math test, and you're sitting there quietly, and if you're of a faith tradition where you're able to pray, silently, close your eyes, and that's fine. No one's going to know, and it's absolutely okay. But what concerns us is that what we think that what may happen is that there will be certain educators who see this as permission to lead their students in prayer, and that is absolutely not what the Supreme Court ruled was constitutional. That would still be unconstitutional, and the reason it is not only because that is an establishment of religion, which is really critical to our idea of religious freedom. So we have our religious freedom rights are kind of dual, twofold. You have the protection from the government establishing a religion, or favoring one religion over another, or religion over non-religion. And you also have the protection to freely exercise your beliefs as much as we can allow that in safe society. And so those two together, what we're afraid of, again, the concern is that teachers will take this as an opportunity to pray in front of students because they think that's what's now allowed, but that's a violation of the Establishment Clause, and that's also a violation of the students' free exercise rights, because they get to come to the school and believe their deeply held beliefs. And if they're now put in a position where they feel like they have to pray to a different god, or participate in some kind of activity that is against their beliefs, now they're in this position where they have to choose between their god and an education, or their god and a starting place on the football team, or their god and club president for a certain club they really want. And that's not okay. That's not what America is about, at least in our opinion.
So I think what's important to remind everybody is that the government's position is not an anti-religious position. It is rather one of protecting the individual from any coercion, in this case, from a student standpoint. So it's one of enabling and empowering the freedom of each individual. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. The way we see the First Amendment is that it really empowers us to bring our full selves to the public square, including our religious selves. And I think that it's really critical to understand that the government not supporting one religion or another is pro-religion, because if we only have to look back in our history to see how the religions who are not in favor, how they are treated, even great examples of from the Church of England, right, and back before this country existed, right, even within Christianity. And that's something we really stress a lot with people is you need to remember that somewhere in this country you are a religious minority. And so if you are interested in protecting your rights, then you have to protect them for someone else. So a lot of my work was in the state of Georgia. And in Georgia, if you're a Baptist, it's really unlikely, or maybe a Methodist, it's really unlikely you're going to need religious freedom protections, because most of your colleagues are Baptists. Most of your bosses, your elected officials, your governor, like they agree with you. But if you're a Mormon, maybe you do need some religious freedom protections in Georgia. But you can take that Baptist out of Georgia and put them in Utah, and the roles will be reversed, right? And so I think that's really critical to remember is if we start to take rights away from people, we make it easy to take them away from ourselves.
Not always going to be your brand of religion that's in power.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what's a good working definition of religious freedom from the standpoint of the Freedom Forum?
Yeah, religious freedom means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and I think that's one of the challenges of working in this space. But there's for us, I think a really standard one comes from the Williamsburg Charter, which is something I recommend all of your listeners look up if they're unfamiliar with it. But religious freedom is the ability for us to shape our lives according to our personal or communal beliefs, and to be able to go out into the public sphere with those beliefs and with those practices. And for us, I think where a lot of the contention around religious freedom is in this metaphor we often use is between a sword and a shield. And it's possible to use your religious freedom rights, your First Amendment rights, your constitutional rights, as a sword to take away the rights of others. But again, we talked about this. When you do that, you have to recognize that only makes it easier to take away your own rights. And so an example I often give of this is when in my time in Georgia, there was a town near me where there was a mosque that was submitted a permit to be built to the local town council. And when people found out about this, a militia showed up the night of the decision. The town council was going to make the decision, and they postponed the decision and they quietly denied it, kind of out of this fear, right? And that's what the newspapers reported. They said mosque denied permit to be built, but it should have said place of worship, because from the government standpoint, there's no difference, right, between a mosque and a church. And so again, if you want to make it easy to you, or if you want to use your rights as a sword and take away the rights of others, you just need to be prepared to know that your rights are now weaker than they were before, when you started. So the other option is to use them as a shield and say, look, maybe I am not a Muslim and don't have use or need of a mosque, but like I want to be able to build my my place of worship, right? So I can go out there and defend the rights of someone else and their ability to freely practice their faith. That's a tide that raises all boats, right? So, I think that's really important to keep in mind when you go out there and want to make kind of arguments about religious freedom or any rights is what are the implications of taking away rights from others?
So we have a different sense of religious freedom, I think, in this country than some other countries that still have very deeply held beliefs about separating government from religion. So let's talk a little bit about the difference, but our kind of uniquely American understanding of that as compared to, say, France or Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think, what's really important is, again, it comes from our history of recognizing that we do not have all these shared backgrounds. And so, what are you going to do in a society where everyone has these different, deeply held beliefs? But you have to have some kind of unity. And I think, again, the First Amendment comes in there and really says, look, we're all guaranteed these rights. And going back to also something I said, that we are able to then bring our full selves into the public square. And there are some places like France where that's not as much true. Like you said, in that defense of secularism, or that protection of secularism, and a real sense of trying to remove church and state, that we can sometimes go too far, in my opinion, in trying to make sure we're protecting all faiths by having none of it out in the public. That's not really the American way. So we talked about before about choosing between an education and your God, and France is a really good example of that, where Muslim women young girls cannot wear head coverings in French public schools. That's absolutely accepted here, and that's, in my opinion, the way we should do it, because one of the things I think religious freedom teaches us is how do we find accommodation with each other? How can we achieve everyone's goals as much as possible? And so let me give you an example from public schools. And it's kind of wild, but this is out from California. And there were a number of Sikh families. Sometimes you'll often hear Sikh, but many Sikhs will say Sikh. So Sikh families, and one of the things that young Sikh children do when they come of age is they wear a dagger across their chest, a ceremonial dagger. It's called a kirpan. And so parents petitioned a school district to allow their kid to wear this kirpan to stagger to school. And obviously, many of your listeners are probably like, whoa, 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 like knives, daggers, it doesn't not allowed in school. No weapons. It's a no tolerance zone. And that's, I think, a really fair and like good place to start, right? Is the safety of all children is the number one concern of any public school. And so we can start there, but what happened was the family and the district kind of had this conversation about, okay, this is incredibly important in order to be able to follow our faith. We would, rather than risk that relationship with our faith tradition by not wearing it, can we find a way to do it? So at first they talked about, what if we tied it in with a leather strap, and really tied it to the hilt, and so it couldn't be removed. And they were like, no, like that, you could still cut a leather strap and you could still pull it out. And so the family said, well, what if we rivet the blade into its sheath, so it's physically not possible to be removed without serious equipment? And the school was like, yeah, that's absolutely okay. And everything was moving forward until an administrator said, well, wait a minute, hey, people are going to see this dagger across this kid's chest and think it's okay to bring knives to school. They're not going to know the background, and that's going to give a confusing message. And so they went back to the family, and the family said, yeah, well, he could wear it under his shirt. So all of this is like everyone then was able to be accommodated, right? The Sikh families were able to practice their faith to the fullest extent, and the school was able to ensure the safety of all their students. To me, that's like a win-win, and that's the kind of thing we should strive for. And I think religious freedom really opens us up to those possibilities of saying, great, how can we find a way, to really accommodate your deeply held beliefs, even if they don't mean much to me, right? Like, even if it's not something that's important to me, doesn't mean that, again, it's not important for me to defend it for you. So I think that's a slight difference in the way that America handles religious freedom than maybe some others.
St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum shares stories from the early American religious experience and the movement towards religious freedom. St. Luke's is a 501c3 nonprofit which relies heavily on public charitable contributions. In order to continue quality programming, like the History from the Old Brick Church podcast, your support is crucially important. Visit us at stlukesmuseum.org/donate for more information about St. Luke's and to make a donation. Thank you for your support.
Religious freedom than maybe some others.
Yeah, so we talked about bringing your full self to the public square. There's always been a lot of court cases that deal with public expressions of any particular faith, or even several faiths. So, for example, can you have the Ten Commandments in the courthouse square? How does the court deal with issues like that?
Yeah, what the court is often looking for is there neutrality in regards to religion or in regards to this government act? So has the government acted neutrally in when they're doing it? So if there are examples of the, say, Ten Commandments being struck down because it was clearly able to be proven that the reason they were erected was a religious one. They were able to show that that was the intent behind them. And that's not neutral in regards to religion, right? That's promoting one religion or religion generally over just neutrality. And so that's been traditionally understood by the Supreme Court is to be the kind of framework. So an example of that then is where it's okay is if the Ten Commandments is set in a law setting, right? So of course they are at the Supreme Court is a really good example of that, where it's not just one, but it is in a setting of many that again provides that neutrality and that understanding of that context. And this is really important because I think, again, you say you were of a faith where the Ten Commandments are important to you, it might be like, well, wait, like this is really great, but like it's not necessarily your interpretation of the Ten Commandments, right? Like it's not always the way you may think of it. And again, there's going to be a time where you are no longer in power. For the longest time for our history, Protestants were not so worried about what was going on in religion and public schools because it was mostly positive for them, right? Catholics and Jews were like, hey, this is really not okay. Can someone, give us some help here? And Protestants were like, it's not a big deal. But as time has changed and as social pressures are different and things happen, and certainly some Supreme Court rulings, now Protestants recognize, well, wait a minute, it doesn't look how it used to. And we want to go back to the way it was. And again, that's going back to that responsibility we have to others to say, hey, we should be concerned for everyone's rights, not just the rights of the majority, not just the rights of the people who want the Ten Commandments up there, or in a public setting.
So, one of the things that seems to be a growing concern, at least on social media, that I've seen is it's not only the idea of freedom of religion, that I can freely exercise my faith, that the government's not going to tell me I have to worship in one particular place or in one particular faith, but also this idea of freedom from religion. And so this seems to me like a little bit of a delicate balancing act here because we do allow religious expression in the public sphere, unlike France. So when people are saying freedom from religion, how do you hear that?
I think it's equally as important and protected under the First Amendment. And so that's really critical to know is that just as the government can't favor one religion over another, they can't favor religion over non-religion. So they have to be neutral towards it. And people should, just as much as they can bring their Christian or Buddhist or Hindu selves to the public square, bring their agnostic, atheist, humanist selves to the public square, and not face any repercussions for that. And so that's, I think, really, really critical. I think this is also one of the key challenge areas for religious freedom in the 21st century is we have religion enshrined in the Constitution as this incredibly important right, the very first right guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. So, it takes huge precedence, which is not a mistake, by the way. Like you have to have the ability to have deeply held beliefs before you need the right to speak about them or the press to write about them or the ability to gather over them or the ability to petition over them. You have to be able to have them first. And that's what religious freedom does. So I think one of the challenges will be is as we have a more or a less religious as the religious nuns rise, which are atheist agnostics, but mostly just the unaffiliated, and the people who are kind of like, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious, that type of stuff. As those rise, I think there is more skepticism to why is religion so protected in the Constitution? Why is it so significant, especially for this Supreme Court, which has ruled in favor of religious claimants more than any other in modern history? And so I think that's going to be a tension area for us moving forward. Is as more people, or as less people see religion as a critical and integral part of daily life, they're going to wonder why government institutions and systems still see it as such and continue to protect it over, say, other rights that they may find more important.
Yeah, it's reminding me of the old Supreme Court decision back in the 50s. I don't remember the case name, but Justice Douglas was ruling over a case I think had to do with busing religious kids to religious events. But he made some kind of comment that the anti-establishment clause doesn't put the government in an adversarial position against religion. So while you can't promote a particular religion, you can't coerce people with a particular religion, the government doesn't feel that it needs to be anti-religious.
Exactly. And then, I think again, that kind of Supreme Court fact is a really good example of how it's certainly not, and at least in practical matters, from the data on the ground.
So another thing we're seeing a lot of in the news today are politicians who are making rather bold claims that there is no such thing as separation of church and state because those words themselves do not appear in the Constitution. So let's talk a little bit about what separation of church and state means, and whether it's actually a constitutional ideal or not.
Yeah. So, I think first of all, it's true the words are not explicitly there, but the idea is absolutely there. That's the shorthand we use to talk about the religious freedom protections that we're given. So I think that's really critical. So you know there's a great actually a longer story. This comes from my old days of being my background's particularly in New Testament studies. That's where I started at the very beginning in my education. And there's this great lesson you learn that the idea of the Trinity is actually a later idea. That is the actual concept of the three in one is not explicit in the New Testament. And it comes later, and that's because it's a way of describing. It's a way people who are looking at the New Testament and reading the New Testament and seeing the stories and the relationship between God and Jesus. That's the tool they use to then describe that in a shorter hand way, right? Rather than going through the complicated long form discussion of why there's a Trinity, they talk about the Trinity, right? And so I think separation of church and state in a way can be seen like that. Is that's the shorthand for our religious freedom protections that we've talked really extensively about. Again, that we do not want a nationalized religion, and in a lot of ways, I think that's the biggest threat to religious freedom. Is these types of ideas where there is no separation between church and state, because we have so much history and recent history of how that goes poorly, how that leads to oppression, that leads to violence, and leads to intolerance. And so, and again, it's very easy to feel that way when you feel like you are on top. But you're not going to be there all the time. The world changes and things shift, and so when you have you tear down that wall, that separation of church and state, then you just really have to be prepared for what it means when someone who you do not agree with has the power. And I think that's again a way of using your rights as a sword rather than a shield.
Should be reminded for people that the phrase even of separation of church and state did not emanate from people who were anti-religious, or rather Roger Williams suggested
Right.
it. He was a very religious guy, and his concern, of course, was for the overreach of government in that sense of separation. So it's something that, regardless of your beliefs, is important to everybody.
Yeah, Roger Williams is a great example of someone who deeply understood, like, he did not think that the Native Americans were practicing a good faith. Like, he had very strong feelings about it, but he felt incredibly strongly about their ability to do so, because he really recognized that, that, hey, Baptists are right there alongside. We they were not the favored child, and they would be treated just the same way if we give more power to the government and to establish religion.
Yeah, also a lot of important dialogue in those days about the idea of toleration, because
Mhm.
toleration is this idea that people with the power can grant tolerance to the groups that are in the minority, but rather we're talking about equality rather than toleration.
Exactly.
So, what do you think is, in fact, the biggest threat to religious freedom and our First Amendment rights? Even can talk about 14th Amendment. What's the biggest threat that we face today?
I think a lot of people would answer this in a lot of different ways. So there are some people who would say Hollywood is the biggest threat, and the way they're changing our society and our ideals. And look, I think it's really important to recognize that the amount of change this country has gone through in one person's lifetime is absolutely staggering. Like, it's really staggering. And I think, so often when we shift the way we think, we're so ready to condemn those who don't come along with us. But I think it's really or it's really important to stress, like, look, the world has changed a lot in this time. But all of that say, I think that the so there's some people who say that. So some people would say the Supreme Court, but that because of they don't agree with the way the Supreme Court is ruling. But really, I think, like, what we were just talking about is the real truth that threat is Christian nationalism, in particular. And because what Christian nationalism really does is it totally goes against not only our founding principles, but our founding history and the experiences of most Americans in this country. And so, I think it's a small group of people in this country who really feel like we should be a Christian nation. But that group is very loud, and as we have seen, the internet gives a lot of power to small groups with loud voices, and so I think we have to be really careful. I think it's really important to recognize that there were two structures built on January 6th, out of lumber, two large structures. One was a platform to hang Mike Pence, and another was a Christian cross. And I think that's those two are intimately tied together in our history, both obviously very recently and in the past. And that level of violence, that level of intolerance, that level of disregard for the historical, experiences and realities of our country, I think is frightening, and I hope it stays that small group and just with a loud voice.
Rather disconcerting when the people that sworn an oath to defend the Constitution apparently haven't read it.
Yeah, right, exactly. And again, it comes back to that thing where it's easy. I get it to think that the way you have power and rights and protection is to remove it from anyone else so that you hoard it all. And that's, I think, really natural. But it just doesn't play out from the historical perspective. That's just not, I mean, again, that's why history is so important, is we can look at time and time again of historical examples of people coming together and able to broaden and expand rights because they came together rather than fight to take them away.
Yeah, I'm thinking about 1820, strangely enough, of when there was the 200th anniversary of the Pilgrim landing, and Daniel Webster gives this famous speech about the city on the hill, and that this maybe that's the origins. I don't know of looking back to the colonial days, but kind of overlooking the revolution and the constitutional period, and
Yeah.
imagining like that never happened somehow.
Well, I think it's really important to recognize that we have not lived up to the ideals that are laid out in the Constitution. We've never done that. And I think that's really clear from a historical standpoint. But that doesn't mean that they're not good ideals, and that doesn't mean that they're not achievable. Um, but it's going to require, again, cooperation in a society where people think deeply different things. And today, I think the problem is that there's a lot of people who profit off of division,
Mm.
not just pundits and people in the news, but also hate groups. Are on the rise, or were on the rise for the last several years. Um, there's a lot of money to be made on keeping us divided, and a lot of people working hard on that. And so, it's going to take a conscious and intentional effort to say, wait a minute, where can we find common ground? Like, where can, my neighbor and I, who might think wildly different things, where can we come together to start a conversation about how we want to improve our town, and then our county and our state? So, I think that's a really important way to think about it again, and rather than isolate and fear, isolation and fear, think about, hey, how can you build that common ground with someone who thinks differently than you?
Yeah, I'm really taken by your comment about we've never really lived up to our ideals. It reminds me of Dr. King suggesting that the promissory note is marked insufficient funds.
Yeah.
Tell us how, as ordinary citizens, we can partner with the Freedom Forum to pursue these ideals of the more perfect union that the preamble of the Constitution suggests for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are, I think if you're interested in what the Freedom Forum is doing, we are constantly putting out resources, videos, columns, events, all sorts of stuff on the First Amendment, on all five freedoms. My specialty, of course, religious freedom, but all five freedoms. And you can follow us on social media platforms at First for All. That's 1ST for all. And know what we're kind of doing. And in just about 6 weeks, on September 24th, we will be in Union City at Discovery Park of America hosting a First Amendment festival. If you're in the area, you should join us. But I think what's really critical for us, what we want you to do, more than engage with us, is we want you to have a better understanding and knowledge of your First Amendment rights, which hopefully this podcast has provided, but then to go out there and defend those rights for others. And that's as simple as just being aware of what's going on in your community and watching how your local newspaper is able to tell its stories and its access to freedom of the press, or watching how your local religious organizations, what access they have to just even simple things like a place to worship. And so starting there, I think, is the right place to start. And then it's always a great idea to write your elected officials and tell them that you value the First Amendment, and that you value the understanding that's a place for common ground, that's not a place to divide us, that it's a starting point to say, hey, you on the other side of the political spectrum, let's have a conversation where we're not always going to agree. Like, that's the important thing. We're not trying to make people come together and sing kumbaya. What we're trying to have people do is say, great, how do I improve the roads in my town, when what most of the country and most of society is telling me is that I need to hate the people who think differently than me. We really want to say, whoa, how can you find that space for conversation?
Absolutely. Well, we're very grateful for the Freedom Forum and the good work that you're doing. And we hope to have you back for some further discussions as we go along, because from our position, history is, it's kind of like the saying, the past is prologue. It still influences us today. So we need to know how that past continues to shape our present and our future. So thank you so much for being with us, David. We're so grateful.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it.
You take care.
You too.
This program was supported by a grant from Virginia Humanities. Virginia Humanities connects people and ideas to explore the human experience and inspire cultural engagement. As the State Humanities Council, Virginia Humanities reaches millions in its estimated annual audience through festivals, grants, fellowships, digital initiatives, teacher institutes, radio programs, podcasts, apprenticeships, and school programs. Headquartered at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia, Humanities works to serve Virginians in every corner of the Commonwealth. To learn more, visit virginiahumanities.org. To learn more about St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum, please visit stluke'smuseum.org.